And now for some intros. Mary Louise Kelly is a mother, a daughter, a wife, a journalist, and a novelist. As she says, the order of these titles, the order by which she defines herself, might shift depending on which moment you catch her. But since 2003, when her first child was born, Mom has been the name she is proudest to answer to. She is the co-host of All Things Considered, NPR's flagship evening news magazine, and previously she spent a decade as national security correspondent for NPR News. She's kept that focus in her role as anchor. That's meant taking All Things Considered to Russia, North Korea, Iran, Ukraine, and beyond. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Politico, Newsweek, and other publications. Heidi Stevens is a Chicago-based writer and the Director of External Affairs for the University of Chicago's TMW Center for Early Learning and Public Health, which works to provide parents, caregivers, and communities the knowledge and tools to optimize foundational brain development in all children. Prior to joining the U of C, Stevens worked at the Chicago Tribune for 23 years, where she wrote a daily column called Balancing Act. She was awarded the Anne Keegan Award for Distinguished Journalism in 2018, and she maintains a nationally syndicated column once a week. She has served on the FAN Board of Directors since September of 2021. And now let's welcome Mary Louise Kelly and Heidi Stevens.
Okay, so those of us who are used to hearing you on All Things Considered, which is probably everyone in this room, are used to hearing you say, in the time we have left.
Yes.
You're usually saying it to, members of Congress and other newsmakers, heads of state. And here we are tonight to talk about a book about, in the time we have left, right? And in the time specifically you had left before your oldest son left for college. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. I'm
Thank you.
So grateful that you wrote it. And also you easily could have looked at the time you had left and decided there was enough on your plate and the last thing you needed was to write a book. But instead you wrote a book.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. And again, thank you all for being here. I should preface by saying, when you hear me saying, in the time we have left, or in the minute we have left, I'm warning the person I'm interviewing, but I'm also letting all of you kind of glimpse behind the curtains. The All Things Considered clock, like the morning edition of clock, 5 times an hour, I have to the second, hit the post, is what it's called. And it's like 1 second late does no good. It's got to be to the second. And so when you're interviewing a senator live about their, explaining their deficit reduction plan, and they're like, well, I got 18 points, and I'm like, Senator, this is not the time. Lay your best one on me, because in the time we have left, that's what we're going to go. So I'm signaling everyone, I got to land this plane, so you don't think I'm incredibly rude when I interrupt him 49 seconds later and say, this is All Things Considered from NPR News.
You never sound
so
rude.
I'll say that. In the context of this book, I was thinking about it. It was just so on my mind. I had in my head a quote from Toni Morrison, the great Toni Morrison, which goes, if there's a book you want to read and no one has written it, then you should write it. And there was a book I really wanted to read, and as far as I could tell, no one had written it, and it had to do with that my oldest child, my oldest son, was 17, turning 18. He was entering his last year of high school, and so it was going to be the last time he was guaranteed to live under the same roof as me, that my family of 4 was going to be intact in my home. And it really came to a point, just to give the specific example, this particular child loves soccer, has played it since he could walk. Before he could walk, he was crawling and pushing a Nerf, pee-wee ball around the room. And by the time he was approaching senior year in high school, he was a starting striker on his school's varsity team in DC. And their games are weekdays, and they start around 4 o'clock. And I have a conflict at 4 o'clock on weekdays, that is to the minute, the time that All Things Considered goes on the air. And every season, I would think, I'm going to figure this out next year. Next year, I will find a way to be there. And was, the summer of between junior and senior year of high school for him, I just thought, I'm out of next year's. I don't have any more do-overs. If I'm going to make a game, I got to make it now. And suddenly the choices that had seemed not easy, but not like the end of the world when there were a zillion soccer games left, I was looking at the schedule. I'm like, I can count on my hands the number left, and that's it. And I would rather cut off my right arm than miss a game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The teenage years, your sons are 15 and 17, I think, at the beginning of the book.
Indeed.
That's not the lens we usually read balancing parenting and career books through. It's usually younger kids, right? But so much of that beautiful, really rewarding stuff of parenting happens during those teenage years. So that's another reason I'm so grateful for this book, because I do think those conversations happen, but they don't happen often around the age that your kids are in this book.
No, there's so many for when you're, geared to, I'm trying to breastfeed and I'm going back to the office and how's this going to work? That juggle at the early end of childhood. And I was staring down the end of childhood. And, if you've ever been a kid, raised a kid, excuse me, you know that those conversations get harder and harder to delegate to a babysitter. Like when your kid needs you, they need you, not just warm body who can get dinner on the table or carpool to the next place. But I also found, forgive me, for me, the big choices turned out really in the end to be the easy calls. Like when my kids were really sick, I found a way to be there. The big birthdays, the big, really important things. It was of the gray space of all, those zillions of soccer games. I mean, I have stood up in the middle of anchoring All Things Considered and said, I gotta go. I remember a specific memory, not that long ago, when a text came in from the babysitter and it said, it began, "Hi, we're in the emergency room." And I was like, I remember turning to Ari Shapiro, who I was anchoring with that day, and saying, I gotta go. You got this? Like, can you? And he's looking at me, and the director's looking at me like, you're leaving? We're on air. And I said, I gotta go. Those calls are easy. It's all the little, you look back and you think, it's all the skinned knees that I was not gonna stand up and flee the studio for, but they're gone, they're over.
Yeah.
I missed them.
There is a time in the book where you talk about taking a call from the school nurse and you're not able to leave what you're doing and go straight there. Tell that story.
This was, I was in Baghdad. My job at the time, this was before I switched to All Things Considered, I was working as Pentagon correspondent for NPR, and part of that job involves trailing the defense secretary when they travel, and you're on the plane with them, you're reporting on what deals they are cutting and who they're talking to and where they go. And on this particular trip, I think we had started in Jordan and come up through southern Iraq. And at the time, this was a few years ago, several years ago, but I imagine it's still true, it's just not safe to drive a motorcade with a US cabinet secretary through the streets. So the way they do it is his plane lands inside the green zone, and to get to the meetings around town, they organize a swarm of helicopters. So in this case, it was Blackhawks, and they're up there and they touch down one at a time. So there's never more than one as a target for incoming fire. And the first one lands and he gets that one, and the second one lands and it's, the generals and admirals and senior officers get that one. They leave the reporters traveling as the press corps, or like the last sitting ducks on the runway waiting for the last helicopter. And so I'm waiting my turn, and I'm wearing full body armor, because even inside the green zone, that's you're in helmet, body armor, the full thing. And my phone rings, and I push back my helmet and answer, and it's the school nurse back in DC telling me that my younger son is sick and how quickly can I get there? Where am I? And I'm thinking, not soon, lady, if you could see where I am. It's not happening today, tomorrow. And she starts yelling and says, I don't mean to bring him home. I mean, he's really sick. He's struggling to breathe. And we need to get him to a doctor or to the hospital now. Where are you? And I started doing the time zone calculation. What time is it there? Where's the babysitter? Where's my husband? And as we're going back and forth, I have to get in the helicopter because they're not waiting on me to finish my conversation with the school nurse. And we take off and I lose the call. The signal dies. And it was several hours before I could get my cell phone to connect again. And I remember sitting in that helicopter and looking down and seeing the traffic and the cars moving beneath us and thinking, what am I doing? What the hell am I doing? I love my job and I worked really hard to get here and I'm good at my job, but my then 4-year-old needs me and I don't know if he's breathing and I'm thousands of miles away in Iraq. What am I doing? And I started on the flight back from that trip. We were flying back to Andrews Air Force Base and I started writing what became my first novel because I wanted to do something that I loved and that felt meaningful, but that I would be a little closer than Baghdad the next time a call like that came in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sweating listening to that story. Sorry. It's stunning. I mean, must be a stunning emotional load to take that call.
Yeah. And he's fine, by the way. He's now 17 and healthy and great, thriving.
Worked out fine. It's easy for those of us who know you as listeners to think of your career as linear and sort of always on an upward trajectory, but it's interesting in the book to see how many sort of off-ramps and on-ramps there are. And during one of those, you tell a story about walking down the streets of DC and seeing Annie, who I know is not her real name, but Annie is the name you give her in the book, and she works for another big news organization, and you're pushing your son in a stroller, your younger son in the stroller, and she doesn't recognize you.
Yeah.
So take us to that moment.
I have on and off-ramped and leaned in and leaned out and done every permutation of working like a crazy woman and not working outside the home at all. And in that moment, I was taking I considered it a year's unpaid leave from NPR to take care of my younger son, who had medical issues and needed therapy, and didn't seem like something I should delegate to a babysitter or wanted to delegate to the babysitter. I say I considered it because when I told NPR this, they pointed out I was not that long back from my second 6-month maternity leave away, and I needed another year. And I said, yes, I do. And they said, fine, but we can't hold your beat for you. And I gave up my job and my press credentials and my microphone and reporter's kit and all the rest, and it wasn't clear that there would be a job waiting for me at the other end of this. So that was kind of where I was. And I was pushing my son to the park. He was 2. And I did run into this great reporter who had the beat I had just stepped away from at another news organization. She was really good. She'd scooped me a bunch, so that was also on my mind. And we ran into each other on the sidewalk as I'm heading to the playground, and I called her name to say hi, and she didn't recognize me. And I realized she's looking the way she always did in this killer suit and heels, and I had applesauce in my hair and probably hadn't worn makeup in many moons and was apparently not recognizable. And we stopped and chatted for a few minutes, and then she said, well, it's lovely to see you and your lovely son. She had a toddler around the same age. I have an interview, I got to get to the White House. Great, I'll tell everyone I saw you. And she put her hand up and got a taxi, and she went. And I was like, I would love to tell you that I was blissfully at peace with my life choices in that moment, because I love my son, and I knew that, he needed me. And it wasn't that I regretted my choices so much as I thought, I'm not sure I recognize myself in this moment. Because that's the track I thought I was on. That's where I was going, and I don't know if I'll ever get back to that. And I beat myself up for the rest of the day, and then life continued, and my son did better. And after a year, I did go back to the newsroom. It was a while, and I eventually ran into this same woman, again, just walking down the street in DC. She recognized me. We chatted for a few minutes, small talk. She had switched to a different job. And as she turned to go, she looked at me and she said, I cried that whole day after I ran into you. I said, what? Like you had it all. You figured it out. You had it all and all at once. And she said, no, I was stuffed into Spanx and like this really uncomfortable suit, and I was going to the White House to do, I can't even remember what story because it was so many news cycles ago that I can't even remember. And I had dropped my daughter at daycare, and I realized I was paying a stranger to take her to the park on that beautiful morning, and you were with your son. And she said, I thought, what am I even doing with my life? And I said, but I thought I'd thrown away my career. And she said, you were singing. Like you were singing to your son when I ran into you. And I thought, you and me both. Yeah. And so much of life depends on what we choose to see. And I don't think anybody was, other than the two of us were judging us or our decisions, and our babies were both fine.
Yeah.
We were fine. You can't be in two places at once.
Right. I think that gets at something I love so much about this book is the gentleness that you grant yourself. It's not that you don't betray any regrets or insecurities or don't take us to the places that feel dark and hard, but I think you're gentle with yourself through most of them, and I think that gives us as readers permission to maybe grant some of that same gentleness to ourselves. So
I hope so. I think it's a work in progress, certainly for me. I find it easier to be gentle and non-judgmental of other people than of my own choices, so I hope that that's true.
It was true for me. And I'm thinking about the story, tell the story if you don't mind, of the trip you took and you left the pink construction paper calendar for your kids to X off.
Yeah.
Or maybe your husband to X off if the kids were too little, each day that you were gone.
When my children were 1 and 3, I think that's right, very young, I had a 2-week reporting trip to Pakistan. And of course thought about, leaving my babies for that long, but they were fine. We had a excellent babysitter, and my husband was around. But I made a pink construction paper chart with a picture of me on it and little hearts and smiley faces, and a day where they could, check off every day I was gone, so they could count down the days till I came back. And I pasted it or taped it to the back of my 3-year-old's bathroom door. And when I came back, it was immediately evident that they had never touched this or had cared about it at all, but some kind adult, either my husband or the babysitter, had probably, as I'm taxiing home from the airport, realized I would notice and had X'd everything off way more neatly than a 3-year-old with a Sharpie would have. But as I thought about that, and I found that when I was looking for something else in a file, I'd forgotten about it, but I'd saved it. I'd peeled it down, from the wall and put it into a file where I kept things, mementos and things from when they were tiny. And I just thought about There is no one I could make a chart like that for now. There was no one who would be at the center of whose world I stand so completely that they might need a chart to count down the days till I return. I mean, my kids love me now, but they're not counting off the days, until they see me again with little hearts and smiley faces. My friends, my mom, my family, And I wish I could go back and tell myself, as the mom of very young children who was hanging on so many days by my toenails, cherish this moment. This moment, you will never stand at the center of someone's world so completely again as the way you do as the parent of a very young child.
And you were trying your best.
I was trying so very hard.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, I think that chart was probably more for me. Obviously, it was more for me. They'd never even looked at it. It was about my guilt of going away. And see, I am a good mom. I've made this chart. I've done the smiley faces and hearts, and it's on your wall, and I'll be back, and all the rest. And that was for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to pivot here into some slightly less parenting-centric parts of the book. You go into the famous Mike Pompeo incident in the book, and I'll ask you if you don't mind to recap that incident a little bit for the audience, just because it did happen a couple years ago. But I'm curious if that was a no-brainer for you to include, or if you waffled a bit on whether that went in the book or not.
Sure. All right, so shall I recount first and then
Recount
remind
first,
me of the follow-up? So the recounting is that when Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State for Donald Trump, I had asked for an interview for months, asking, can I come talk to you about China? Can I come interview you about Syria? Like whatever was in the news that month, I was asking, and didn't come through. January of 2020, there were a couple of massive things happening in US foreign policy. One was that was the month the US and Iran nearly went to war. The US had just assassinated the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, and Iran had threatened retaliation, and Trump went on primetime TV to threaten missile strikes on Iran. And as it happens, I was in Iran, in Tehran, and had gotten an interview with Iran's foreign minister, who had some not particularly complimentary things to say about Mike Pompeo, his American counterpart, who had just decided that Iran's foreign minister could not travel to the United Nations, even though it's UN territory, not US, and there's long-standing precedent that foreign diplomats can come. Anyway, he had some not complimentary things to say, so while I was in Tehran, I got an email from the US State Department saying, voila, Mike Pompeo will talk to you when you get back. Interview request granted. So I went to talk to him. I was given 10 minutes. I wanted to ask about Iran because we had just nearly gone to war with Iran. But the other big thing happening that month was that the Senate was in the middle of an impeachment trial of the then President of the United States over matters to do with Ukraine. And most of the people testifying as witnesses were members of the foreign policy establishment and diplomats who worked for Mike Pompeo. Pompeo had been on the famous call with Zelensky, just do me I need you to do us a favor call. And so I told State Department press aides the night before, I'm going to ask about Iran, I'm going to ask about Ukraine, I'm going to ask about anything else the news gods serve up overnight, because I never agree to take anything off the table. Why would I? Like, if something huge happens overnight, I'm not going to rule out my ability to talk about it. So we go in. It was a pretty contentious interview from the start, and we spent the majority of the time on Iran, and then I pivoted and asked about Ukraine, and Mike Pompeo was really not happy to be asked about Ukraine, and it got extremely contentious. so contentious that the press secretary cut it short before the allotted 10 minutes was up. And I thanked him, and he did not verbally reply, but got very close, leaned down, and glowered at me, and then left the room. So we are packing up our gear, and the same press aide reappears and summons me to his living room on the 7th floor. This is the 7th floor of the State Department in Washington. He has a pretty small office where his desk is, but then there's a big expansive living room. And he was waiting for me there and proceeded to swear at me for about the same amount of time as the interview itself had lasted. He asked, did I think Americans care about fucking Ukraine? Forgive my language, but I'm trying to quote accurately here. I said, yes, I think they do. He asked if I could even find Ukraine on a fucking map. And I said, yes. And he called for his aides to bring in a map, a very weird map that had no names or international borders, just blobs, continents. And I pointed to Ukraine, and he put the map away and said, people will hear about this. And I agreed that they would. And he said he had things to do and left, and I thanked him again and then went straight to the NPR bureau at the State Department and filed live for Morning Edition. And the conversation in the newsroom was, what do we do with the map test portion? Do we report this? Because my goal is I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. I'm not trying to have a gotcha moment, but we discussed it, and I ultimately felt there was news value in Americans understanding how much value our nation's top diplomats seemed to place on the relationship with Ukraine in a moment when then, as now, Ukraine was dominating the news agenda. And I also thought there was value in Americans glimpsing how our top diplomat conducts himself behind closed doors. Not just any member of the cabinet, but the one who is specifically charged with upholding and defending American values worldwide, including freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So I called the State Department back and told them I'm going to report this, including the language and the swearing and the map test, and do you have any further comment or context you want to provide? And they did not. And the interview aired nationwide and made headlines around the world. And the next morning, Mike Pompeo put out a statement on official State Department letterhead calling me a liar, saying I had agreed to talk only about Iran. And I thought, I have in writing my exchange with your press secretary where I specifically said I would ask about Ukraine, but okay. And also suggested that I had confused Ukraine with Bangladesh when he did the map test. Didn't deny that there was a map test, just suggested I had pointed to Bangladesh. On which I have no comment other than to note it's on a different continent and is thousands of miles away.
And then you had to decide whether to keep that tit for tat, he said, she said going. Do I allow myself to become the story rather than a person who reports the story? I think your words were dignifying sort of a toddler level tantrum with a response.
Yeah, I did think, that statement landed in my inbox on a Saturday morning, and I was alone in the kitchen, and I thought, I couldn't think of a constructive response. So I went for a run, and I came back and thought about it and thought, I had interview requests coming in to talk about the interview, and I thought, I just want that journalism to stand on its own. We aired it completely unedited, not even a or an was taken out, end to end, unedited, so that people could hear in full what had happened. And I did think, there's nothing in my life that has prepared me for being called a liar by the US Secretary of State. And then I thought, no, actually, nothing in my journalism experience has, but I have been the mother of toddlers. And you learn there are some behaviors that are just not worth giving a response. So we didn't.
That's right. That's right. There were several moments throughout the book where I thought that you, and you said as much overtly, I'm not trying to impart myself with special wisdom, that your role as mother informs your role as journalist, and to the extent of the stories you would choose to tell, and also the way you told them. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Hannah Hapko, the woman who was served in Parliament in Ukraine.
She did.
But also is a mother, and a mother of a daughter who wanted a guinea pig.
Yeah. So I first met the first time in Kyiv last year, right before the war. And we were interviewing her originally because she had been one of the original leaders in 2014, the pro-democracy protests. And she'd galloped the country in those protests, had known, had run for parliament, had rising star, had become chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Ukraine's parliament, and traveled constantly and was very prominent in Ukraine. By the time I met her in this pizzeria in Kyiv last year, she had stepped away from parliament, and she was still so feisty that I couldn't, she's like so clearly a patriot that I couldn't figure out why she had left government service. So I'm asking her questions, trying to figure this out. And she finally said, I love the work, I love my country, but I have an 11-year-old daughter and I never saw her. And so we talked about that. And February, late January, early February of last year, Russia had invaded.
I can hand you this if you want it.
Let's see. Is it back?
Yeah.
All right. I asked why she had left Parliament. She said, I never see my daughter. And what's really stressing me out is this 11-year-old daughter wants a guinea pig. And I can't figure out whether I should buy it for her, because if Putin invades and we have to evacuate, I will be stuck evacuating not just my family, but a rodent, and the cage, and food pellets, and all of that. Just kidding it out.
Okay.
How's this? Are we back? Okay. So we're mid-rodent evacuation plans here. What was seriously stressing her out was that she was going to have to, thank you, evacuate a rodent if Vladimir Putin did invade. And she was so stressed out by this. This woman who had literally led a revolution that she started crying, which made me cry. And then we do the interview, and the feedback and response we got from people in America who are rooting for this family and their guinea pig. And as we all know, Russian troops did invade. Hanna Hopko managed to get her daughter safely out with grandparents through Lviv and then west into Poland. She went into hiding in Kyiv because she was on the so-called kill list that Russia had as a pro-democracy activist there. And she had to go into hiding with the guinea pig. And the last year has been a saga where I have since interviewed her. We've done 4 or 5 interviews where I ask about she's been to Washington to meet with the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and with Congress, and she's lobbying for more weapons and aid and supplies. And I interview her about all this, and we air these interviews, and everybody always says, but what about the guinea pigs? We always ask about the guinea pigs. So the guinea pig is fine. The daughter is fine. The family is still not reunited. But to the question about how being a mom has informed my journalism, I am quite sure that 25-year-old Mary Louise would have been sitting there in Ukraine, and this woman would have started crying about getting her daughter a guinea pig, and I would have been like, yeah, but sanctions, NATO, let's talk about the important stuff. Who cares about this rodent, Russia's about to invade? And the mom in me latched on and thought, that's the story. Like, that's the story. I'm trying to explain what the stakes are in Ukraine, and ordinary people who are just like us, who are living through something unimaginable. How can I let you glimpse that and come into this country with me for a moment? And I don't know that there's a parent on the planet that doesn't get, my kid is begging for a pet. The stakes may not be as high as I'm going to have to evacuate if Russian tanks roll in, but we all know, like, really, is this a great thing for my family? Do I need to get the kid this pet that they're begging for? We can all empathize with that, and it has changed totally the way I approach a story, including a war. It's the human stories. It's those little moments.
Everything's a human story. And I think that sometimes you need the right lens to remind you of that. But of course, it's a war is a story, but war is a human story, right? Yeah. Budgets are a human story. Congress is a human story, right? Yeah.
You can't wrap your head around sanctions, but you can wrap your head around, like, somebody struggling to get dinner on the table for their family that night.
Yeah. Another thing you write about in the book is your near total hearing loss, which I don't think a lot of people probably knew about until... I can't
tell if the mic is going in and out because I can't hear it.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about that, including, again, the decision to let the general public into that part of your world.
Yes, I am deaf, or something close to it. I have severe to profound hearing loss in both ears. I wear hearing aids. I anchor, all things considered, wearing them every night, and would not be able to otherwise. And I just turned 52. I got them about a decade ago in my early 40s. So I was very young. I had felt for a while like everyone mumbled all the time. I had noticed I needed to watch TV with the subtitles on. I had developed a weirdly antagonistic relationship with the FedEx guy because he kept insisting that he had rung the doorbell to deliver packages, and I kept insisting you couldn't have. I was home. I would have heard it. So there were signs, but my kind of wake-up call was actually doing an event like this where I was on stage with my first book, actually, and people were asking questions, and I couldn't hear any of them. And it became apparent everyone else can hear the questions. And I realized I had been kind of faking my way through it, struggling for a long time. In part, my day job in the studio, I'm in a professionally soundproofed room. The acoustics are perfect. An NPR quality, an NPR professional studio is about as perfect acoustics as you could get. I'm wearing professional headphones. I can turn them up as loud as I need. It's not a problem, but in a room like this, it's hard. So I went and got my hearing tested. The other thing was, this is just kind of public service announcement, I to this day pass fine the component of just your annual exam where they say, raise your hand if you hear the beep. I can hear the beep. What I can't do, as I learned when I finally got my tail to an audiologist's office, was distinguish between consonants. So the test that made clear I need intervention here is one where the audiologist says a word and you repeat it. So, sandbox, go for it.
Sandbox.
Yeah. Yardstick,
Yardstick.
bicycle,
Bicycle.
whatever. I think in the first test, I think I got 16 out of 20 right, something like that. So it wasn't perfect, but it wasn't, not functioning.
Alarming.
Yeah. And then the audiologist repeated the test with hand in front of his mouth. So I couldn't see his lips. And I missed 70%. And I thought, wow, if I didn't know I could read lips, but apparently I have been. And if I can't read your lips, there's no context because it's just a word, I missed 70%. And it's worse at high frequencies, which is really annoying and unfair. It makes it harder to hear women's voices than men because higher pitch. So I got hearing aids, and it was and has been life-changing.
Yeah. I loved the way you pointed out that there's still a bit of a stigma around acknowledging hearing loss, around getting an intervention for hearing loss in the form of hearing aids, in a way that we don't still attach, and maybe never did, to, say, pulling out your reading glasses at a restaurant when the light is dim. It's just sort of a move anybody makes.
Yeah.
So I wonder if part of your hope in telling the story is to chip away at that stigma a bit.
Absolutely. I'm wearing contacts right now. I can't see without them. There's zero stigma attached to that, but there is to hearing aids. It's seen as something old. And, with the deepest respect for people in their later years, I was in my early 40s. I didn't want to be old. I got them, and I think I felt that stigma for a couple of weeks. I remember feeling self-conscious about pulling my hair back because you can obviously see them more easily. But the new hearing aids are tiny. They Bluetooth, so I can talk on my phone, I can hear my music, and I figure everyone walks around with earbuds in all the time anyway,
right.
So who cares? Why not?
Right.
It's easy. It's life-changing. I really encourage everyone, none of us here like we did when we were 16.
Yeah.
You can muddle through a lot, but why not get it checked out, get a baseline? Yeah. I really, really encourage it. And it's also, hearing is a complicated sense. With sight, I think you have more, you're driving in a car with someone, they can read the billboard, you can't. You think, okay, I should go get glasses. With hearing, it's harder to tell. Can everybody else hear this or not? In a crowded restaurant, it's hard for anybody to hear. So where's that line? And there are different types of hearing loss. For me, again, it's, did you just offer me a cut of water? Did you offer me a cub of water? I know because of context, you probably offered me a cup. And I feel like I can hear the difference in those words as I say them to you, but for me, speaking English now, it sounds crazy, but it's a little bit like speaking a foreign language that you know very well, but not totally fluently, and you're just constantly playing catch up.
Yeah.
Just like 2 or 3 words behind, trying to make sense of it, as the words as your ear is trying to decode them. But I'll tell you this, I could hear my footsteps when we crossed that stage. I remember getting hearing aids on the first day, leaving the audiologist's office and stopping in my tracks on my way to the elevator, what is that noise? And realizing, it's my footstep, and I guess I haven't heard that in years.
Wow.
I can hear birds sing. I missed that. Wow. You don't realize you're not hearing, you don't realize what you're missing. And my most profound thing in the context of the book was the summer I got hearing aids picking up my kids from summer camp, and they were strapped in the back seat and chattering and giggling about something that had happened at camp that day. And I thought, oh my God, they're talking and I can hear them. They must have been chattering and giggling away for years in the back seat, and I missed it.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah.
And it was so It was so bittersweet, just the joy. Oh, I can hear it now.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew, obviously, I'm looking in the rearview mirror. I know they're chattering, but you just don't realize what you're missing. And then just the sadness at how much I must have missed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the bravest part of the book, and this is a book that features flak jackets, is when you say you miss the wolf whistles. Around age 50, you're no longer getting catcalled and you miss it. So talk about that.
Yeah. There's a part of me that can't believe I admitted this in a book or that we're about to have this conversation.
It was brave.
I opened that chapter saying, am I allowed to say this?
You absolutely are.
I miss being wolf whistled. And let me clarify. It still happens, but less. Certainly less than in my 20s. My 25-year-old self, if she were here, would say, have you lost your mind? You miss being catcalled and you want to admit that out loud? And I hear you. I hear you looking at their 25-year-old self. And I also want to say, I'm not condoning men or anyone acting like creeps or in an offensive way. I think what I was getting at was that so much of what I write about in the book is about interior changes in my home or in my heart. But the book is about, my son's last year at home. It was also the year I lost my dad, who I was very close to. It was also the year I turned 50. It was also the year I thought we were emerging from a pandemic that had rendered life unrecognizable to all of us. And realizing that as all these shifts were going on, the way the world sees and reacts to me is also changing. And I have gray hair and laugh lines, and I am proud of all of those. I have earned them. I'm totally fine with looking my age at 52 and hope that will continue for as long as we've got. I think it was more speaking about how invisible you can feel as a woman in middle age. I just wasn't expecting quite how unseen a woman of 50 could feel to walk through a crowd and just nobody ever looks. And I think what it speaks to is, this is not unique to women, but perhaps women feel it in a different way, that being rendered invisible, whether it's in our careers or in our lives or moving through a crowd, it's real. And I have been wrestling with that and thinking about it. And the allure of the wolf whistle is not about being ogled by some creepy stranger. It's about feeling you're seen, you're alive, you exist, you're here, you're still making a mark. And for that 1 second that the wolf whistle comes in, it's I see you, you got it, you're still here. That's what I miss.
Yeah, I love that. I'm very glad that you went there in the book.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're about to wrap up. 5 more minutes. I'm going to ask you to put on your All Things Considered co-host hat for a second and take us inside the newsroom at NPR headquarters. Right now, we're leading up to maybe a Biden-Trump presidential rematch. What's happening that wasn't happening leading up to the last Biden-Trump matchup at NPR? Are you having different conversations? Are you having the same conversations? What's it like at NPR right now going into 2024?
Well, thank you for the question. Like every journalist, every news organization, we have been thinking hard since 2016 and then again since 2020 about how to responsibly and fairly cover politics, which are like nothing I've seen in my life or any of us have. And I want to just preface this by saying, like, whatever your politics, it is a challenge to cover a president of the United States who lies, which he does. Talking about former President Trump. How do you cover that? How do you give context? we have learned a lot of things along the way. At NPR, we have made a lot of mistakes along the way. We are still figuring it out. But I will say, Donald Trump, as for now, the front runner for the Republican nomination, again, trying to figure out how do we do this. And a recent test was when he was indicted in Manhattan. We knew that was coming, and we knew that he was going to be flying back to Mar-a-Lago to give a live speech, and that the networks were covering it. So how are we going to cover it? And we had a lot of discussions inside the newsroom over how to do this. It's huge news when not only a former president is, it's historic. It's never happened that a president of the United States has faced a criminal charge. And not just a former president, but one who would like to be president again. There's no question we're going to cover it, but we made several decisions, such as the Mar-a-Lago speech we will not take live. We had a reporter there. We had the feed coming in. I was anchoring our special coverage that night. We covered the speech. We gave a full analysis, but we didn't take it live, which we would have probably previously, and which, CNN was there taking it live. And that's no shade on them. They were making the decisions they were making. Ours was, it's impossible to fact check and provide context in real time. And he said a lot of things that are not true. So we took pieces of it, we analyzed it, we talked about, legal ramifications, political ramifications, where does this go next, all of it. But we didn't take it live. The other thing we did that was a little bit different was we have all these conversations in our newsroom. How are we going to cover this? Why are we going to cover it this way? Where should we have reporters? Do they need to be at Trump Tower and at the courthouse, in and outside? And yes, we did all of that. But we are trying, I am certainly trying on all things considered, to be more transparent with our audience. This is how we're thinking about this. Here's why. And you're free to think we got it wrong, or we blew it on the coverage, or we overcovered it, or we undercovered it. But I had our one of our managing editors and senior vice presidents for news come on All Things Considered that day and explain, here's what we're covering, here's how we're doing it, here's why. Just to try to pull back the curtain a little bit on it. And my goal in that is, in an era of so much distrust of the media, some of it earned, much of it earned. In an era where, we have, again, this former president talking about fake news, to let you glimpse. Look, we're not making the right call every time, I'm sure, but we're trying, and here's how we're thinking about it and the rigor we're trying to bring on this, to bear on this story.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that insight. And thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you for this
fun.
book.